Making Adagio Scream by Jay the Brony. I'm not sober. I hope you're not sober. I didn't read the first one. This one had the sex tag. Yeah. Let's try this. When one thinks of a trio of sirens banished from another world, the word normal is not really the word that comes to mind. And yet, that was exactly the scene that the three sisters found themselves in. It was late in the afternoon, and Adagio, Aria, and Sonata were all busying themselves with one task or another in their home, a modest apartment on the edge of the town of Canterlot. Aria was laying on the sofa reading some magazine. Sonata was transfixed upon some kids' show airing on TV. As for Adagio, she was spending her time cooking the day's evening meal for the three. Tonight it was soup, and after putting in a few herbs, she stirred it around for a bit before turning towards her sisters. Although things between them were cordial on most days, recently there had been something of an annoyance between them, or, to be more specific, an annoyance that Adagio had with the other two. It had been thanks to a certain gift given to them by their one-time rivals, the Rainboons, which had, for lack of a better word, put Adagio in a tight situation. Needless to say, the elder sister was still somewhat angry at them for their relative lack of help. At least it's over now, Adagio thought. No thanks to those two. Letting out a sigh, she turned her attention back to the soup, which seemed to be progressing nicely for the time being. As such, she moved it off the heat to settle for a bit, since they weren't due to eat for some time. Turning, she walked over to the sofa, looking down at Aria with her arms crossed. "So, ticked anyone else off today?" Aria didn't even bother looking up from her magazine as she answered. "Just a couple of punks in the cafeteria. Nothing you need to worry about." Adagio let a groan after hearing that. "Damn it, Aria. We're on shaky ground as it is, without you picking fights. Remember when you got called to Vice Principal Luna's office last week? We can't afford to stir up trouble anymore." Aria let out a snort of her own once her sister had finished speaking. "Ugh, you're the worst sometimes, you know that, Adagio." Adagio narrowed her eyes at the middle sister before turning towards Sonata, who was thankfully too involved in the TV to notice the argument. Raising her hands, Adagio began to rub her temples and blah. Adagio began to run her shit. Adagio began to rub her temples a bit to try to relieve the stress. Maybe some time alone would do me good, she thought, and so she made her way towards her bedroom door. The door creaked as it opened, and the elder siren closed it behind her. All three of them had their own rooms, and each was tailored to suit their specific tastes. Sonata's room Sonata's was a room that drowned in blues and pinks, damn near filled to the brim with stuffed animals. Aria's had a more punk rock feel, with posters of local bands as well as a darker coloring. As for Adagio, she settled on nothing less than a room that screamed luxury, and it bore not only comfortable and expensive-looking furniture, but also a massive four-poster bed. But also a massive four-poster bed that one might assume belonged to a queen, which, in fairness, was how the eldest sister viewed herself. Well, that's nice. She let out a contented sigh as she looked upon her surroundings, taking a step forward before sitting on the end of her bed, enjoying the soft feel of the mattress. She bent over to pull off her purple boots, placing them on a side for the whatever. She bent over to pull off her purple boots, placing them to the side for the time being. However, it was only after leaning back from this that she started to notice something. Something that she knew did not belong in her room. Turning, she saw that there, standing on a nearby small table by her bedside, was a tiny plant pot, out of which grew a familiar black growth. Immediately, she jumped off the bed and backed away from the plant, a look of utter terror upon her face, for this was the same creature that had caused her so much grief not so long ago. True, it no longer seemed to bear the massive and monstrous form it had at the time, and indeed remained just a static twig at the moment. But that didn't stop Adagio from being fearful at the thing being anywhere near her. Within moments, she rushed towards her door and wrenched it open, after which she stepped outside and looked upon her sisters with utter fury. "Is this some kind of joke?" Both Arya and Sonata turned to look at her, both seemingly somewhat confused at her behavior. Fuming, Adagio firmly pointed inside her room, prompting both her sisters to stand up from what they were doing and take a look inside. It only took a few seconds, but after they both noticed the plant, they understood their sister's anger. Arya let out a hearty chuckle at this, and Adagio had no doubt she was reminiscing about the recent incident the plant caused. As for Sonata, she looked upon the creature with an expression that seemed to indicate that she just remembered something important. "Oh yeah, I figured you and he didn't really get off to a good first impression, so I figured, why not just put him in your room to get you better... What the fuck? Why not just put him in your room to get you better used to him?" Adagio stared at her sister, not quite sure if she was kidding or not, but then again, this was Sonata, and if she was willing to go ahead and say something that absurd, chances were she meant every word of it. The chipper way she was looking at Adagio certainly didn't help matters, as the elder sister slapped her head in frustration over it all. "Sonata is not a he, it's an it, and secondly, I want it out of my room." The blue-haired girl started to look a little down at that. "Aw, come on, Dodgy, just one night?" "No!" Adagio replied immediately. Sonata responded to that by starting to pout, completely with a puppy dog eyes look. "Pretty, please?" Adagio, having been subjected to this look from her sister many times before, immediately looked away to avoid looking in her eye, which she knew would certainly lead to her agreeing to her terms. She tried her hardest, but in time she couldn't help herself and glanced to the side just for a little bit, just to see if she was still pulling that face. Sure enough, she was, and in mere moments Adagio's resolve broke down like collapsing like my ass. Adagio's resolve broke down like a collapsing building. Letting out a frustrated groan, Adagio faced Adagio. Fucking. Letting out a frustrated groan, Adagio faced her sister fully, giving a single unhappy nod, a sign of her consent. I'm guessing there won't be much more consent after that. Squealing with happiness, Sonata immediately wrapped her arms around Adagio and held her in a tight hug, much to the latter's chagrin. It was only here that Adagio noticed that Arya had been watching the whole thing, doing her best to hold back what had to be a massive chortle. One angry look from Adagio, however, and Arya soon made herself scarce. One angry look from Adagio, however, and Arya soon made herself scarce. Fuck. Bollocks. One angry look from Adagio, however, and Arya soon made herself scarce. A few moments afterwards, Sonata finally let go of her sister, and, once free, Adagio raised up a single index finger towards her. "But it's for one night only. Got it? If that thing tries something with me, I'm kicking it out. Understood?" We know where this is going. Sonata nodded enthusiastically, prompting Adagio to roll her eyes as she made her way back into her room, closing the door behind her as she did so. Now it was just her and the plant, alone in her bedroom. She glared angrily at the thing, never letting her eyes stray from it, as she made her way towards her bed. So focused was she on the creature that she failed to notice where she was walking, and soon she accidentally kicked one of the wooden posts of her bed. Immediately she winced at the pain at the feeling of it, spinning around and sitting on the edge of the bed as she lifted up her leg, grabbing the end of her foot and nursing the spot that collided with the wood. Gah! She thought, as if this day couldn't get any worse. I'd speak my mind on this matter, but I'd rather not with my sisters within earshot. I have to keep up appearances and all. As such, she continued to nurse the sore spot for a few moments before simply letting out a groan and falling backwards, her head colliding with the softness of the mattress. And that hair. No, wait, that's not in the story. Wanting a better position to rest on, she started scooting on her... Wanting a better position to rest on, she started scooting on her back up the bed until her head was where it should be. Right against her large and fluffy pillow. Makes me think about different things, like titties. It was a pleasant feeling before... No, that's not... It was a pleasant feeling, being up against that kind of softness, and for a moment she felt almost relaxed from it. The soreness was still present, but she did her best to ignore it for the time being, closing her eyes and just hoping that she would get some peace and quiet for a bit. Of course, her earlier annoyance at everything that had happened interfered with her ability to really relax. And so she spent a good deal of time simply turning from one side to the other, letting out frustrated groans at her predicament every once in a while. However, after several minutes had passed, something strange happened. Is it vagina time? Adagio felt a slight poking motion against her foot, almost like someone's finger. This led her to crack open one eye and look down to see what was happening. This soon clued her in to what was happening. As she saw that the black plant had once more extended itself. Wow, that sounds all kinds of wrong. But this was not the tentacled monstrosity that had bound her before, but rather a single thin vine stretching out from the pot and poking her in the foot. It was doing nothing beyond that, but even so, the effect was immediate, as Adagio instantly pulled her legs away from it, sitting upright on her bed and holding her knees to her chest as she watched it. What do you think you're doing? Didn't you hear me? One false move and you're out, got it? The vine, to Adagio's surprise, actually seemed to respond to that, lifting upwards slightly before pointing right at her and tilting to the side a bit, almost like some puppy looking confused. Adagio watched it with a raised eyebrow as it began to inch closer, but never in a manner that suggested aggressiveness. She was still wary, as one would expect after the last encounter with the thing, but to its credit, it didn't seem to be doing anything malicious, merely sliding along the bed until it reached her foot again, wherein it once more poked it slightly. Confused, Adagio looked down at the thing and tried to nudge it away with the foot in question. What? You want something? Water? Plant feed, maybe? The vine pointed up towards her, and thought it had no eyes. Adagio was sure it was actually looking right at her, or at least sensing her in some way. Naturally, since it had no mouth, it couldn't simply give her a straight answer, and instead kept on poking like it had been doing for the whole time. The elder siren let out a groan of annoyance, knowing that the thing wasn't getting the message. However, a slight sense of curiosity began to grip her as she wondered just what the thing wanted of her. There's only one vine so far, she thought, so if it tries anything, I could probably get away this time. Whatever it wants, It seems keen to get it, so perhaps it might be prudent to test it a little. Hesitantly, Adagio started moving the feet. Hesitantly, Adagio started moving the foot currently poked by the vine, inching it further away from her and lifting it up somewhat. The vine, meanwhile, simply remained motionless as she did this, only starting to approach her again after she stopped moving. Adagio watched with interest as it began to poke several spots on the foot before eventually reaching the point where she kicked the bed earlier. That poke sent another wince of pain through her, and the vine reacted immediately, withdrawing from her slightly, almost as if it was aware that it had caused her pain. It was a reaction that intrigued Adagio a great deal. As such, she remained still as she let the vine continue. It approached her yet again, and ever so slowly began to coil around the whole of her foot. Adagio felt wary of this, ready to leap out of the bed at a moment's notice. But then she experienced surprise as the vine, now coiled around her foot, began to gently squeeze and apply pressure to the sore spot and things. At first, it was an uncomfortable feeling, but in time it was as if the pain was being kneaded out of her, to the point of where she actually started to feel more relaxed from it. Well, she thought, of all the times I expected this thing to... what? Times? I'm fucked in the head. Well, she thought, of all the things I expected this thing to do, a massage is not one of them. Maybe it's trying to say sorry for what it did to me before, as well it should. Never one to turn down an offer like this, Adagio simply reclined back into her pillow as the vine continued to do its work, carefully applying more pressure, not just to the sore area, but to the rest of her foot as well. In time, the pain was gone entirely, much to Adagio's satisfaction. Not bad. Been a long time since someone gave me that kind of service. Unbeknownst to Adagio, the vine seemed to have heard her, and before she knew it, there were several other tendrils now growing from the pot and slowly creeping towards her. Inch by inch, they made their way to her, and it was only when they started poking the side of her leg that she finally opened her eyes and took notice. As before, she seemed more than a little wary of these new arrivals, and even inched backwards a bit. Sensing her hesitation, the vines stopped dead in their tracks, as if waiting for her permission to continue. Needless to say, this was a very strange situation that Adagio found herself in, and while there were more than a few alarm bells going off in her mind in this, her sheer curiosity was more than loud enough to drown them out. So, slowly, she resumed her previous position, lying flat on her back and keeping an eye on the vines before giving a single nod. The tendrils appeared to notice this, and as such, they continued moving closer to her. This is the most consensual tentacle rape I've ever heard. One of them moved over to Adagio's other foot, mimicking the coiling motion the first one had done, before giving her yet another soothing massage. As for the others, they moved to a few spots on her legs, mostly on the thighs, and, like before, gently coiled around them before carefully applying pressure to her. Adagio had to admit it was a pleasant sensation. These things know what they're doing. I'll give them that. A sigh escaped her lips as she allowed herself to relax a bit more, but her eyes stayed open, especially as she began to see yet more vines appearing in far greater numbers emerge from the pot. They approached and surrounded her, always in a slow speed, perhaps to avoid causing her distress. The siren watched as they made their way for her arms and even her shoulders, where they began to carefully press against her in the areas that had been feeling tense. In spite of her earlier reservations, Adagio could not help but form a smile upon her face as her new roommate continued its impromptu massaging. A thought then popped into her mind as she considered how best to enjoy this. Given her history with this thing, she knew it was a risk, but even so, she was enjoying herself far too much right now to be bothered by such things. So, she began to sit up, with the vines withdrawing from her arms as she did so. Raising her arms, she began to remove the puffy, light purple shoulder section of her garment, wherein her bare shoulders were now exposed. After flinging that item of clothing aside, she looked to the vines and gave them a smirk and a wink before starting to move again. She began to move in such a way that she was now lying on her front, with her bare back now facing the vines that still hovered above her. Turning her head, she gave them a look that practically screamed, "Knock yourself out," before resting her head on the pillow. Understanding her meaning instantly, the vines moved forward, and soon enough Adagio was enjoying a number of soothing motions across her back as she began to let out a soft moan. This carried on for several minutes, with Adagio loving every minute of it, before something new started. The siren opened her eyes to see several of the vines were gently tugging at certain parts of her clothing. Nothing forceful, but enough to make their intention clear. "So, want to get a little personal look at the Siren Queen, do you?" Adagio asked with a smirk. The vine tips all pointed towards her at the sound of her voice, and she let out a chuckle at it. "Well, in fairness to you, you're not the first to want to get me out of my clothes, and since you've done such a good job, I suppose I can relent on this one occasion." The vines began to approach her, but stopped when she raised a finger towards them. "But it had better be a damn good service, you hear me?" Displaying the kind of seeming intelligence they'd shown since this began, the vine tips moved up and down like a nodding motion, before going ahead with the permission they'd been given. Adagio watched as the plant began to carefully pull at the various segments of her clothes. Her belt, her leggings, and even her purple bodysuit. She watched as, bit by bit, she became more unclothed, with the vines carefully placing her garments all around her, a safe distance away. In time, all that she found herself wearing was her underwear, a simple purple set of bra and panties. Few had ever seen her this way, and as always, Adagio was wary of how far this plant wanted to take things with her. Nevertheless, she leaned back and rested upon the bed to allow them to go to work. And get to work they did, for within moments there was almost a dozen tendrils, all working at every single soft spot on her body. Legs, arms, belly, chest. There was no part of her that wasn't being gently and carefully kneaded and soothed. "This thing is a miracle worker," she thought. "I haven't felt this relaxed in ages." As her muscles became less and less tense, there was even some risk that she might actually fall asleep during this. She didn't know how long the plant had been tending to her, and in truth, she didn't much care. If this thing is willing to do this kind of stuff for me on a regular basis, I think I'll have to forgive it for its earlier transgressions. A smile formed on her lips as she slipped further into a state of relaxation. But as the minutes rolled on, she was suddenly brought out of her comfortable state by a sudden poking somewhere very private. Her head shot down to look and see what she already suspected. Sure enough, there was one of the vines, lightly poking against the front of her panties. 1,000 thoughts passed through Adagio's mind as she considered what this meant. Okay, it's pretty obvious what this thing wants to do to me now. The question is, do I let it? I mean, it's not as if I don't appreciate the kind of attention every once in a while, but to do it with a plant? I don't think that's the kind of thing I ever expected to share my bed with. Still, it has been doing a pretty bang-up job with the rest of me, so who knows? Maybe it's be interesting to see how good it is at other things. Yet more time passed on as Adagio considered this choice carefully, and as she did so, all the vines seemed to stop their various massages, turning towards her to wait for the answer. Eventually, the siren let out a sigh and gave a sly smile before nodding to the vine down below. The tendril seemed to shiver with excitement after being given that kind of permission, to which Adagio had a chuckle. Afterwards it withdrew slightly as the siren began to reach down and gripped onto the edge of her panties. A moment of hesitation flickered across her eyes briefly before she resolved herself and pulled the clothing down, exposing herself completely. After kicking the panties away, Adagio reclined once more, watching carefully as the tendril slowly approached her private area yet again. Licking her lips, Adagio observed as the tendril gradually made its way to her opening, giving it a quick and gentle poke. The effect was immediate, as the siren felt a quick jolt of pleasure run through her. As she let out a moan, the tendril took that to mean it was doing something right, and so moved in further, pressing a little bit harder against her. It did this for some time, only penetrating her the tiniest bit, moving left and right to stimulate her further, to the point she was actually grabbing hold of the bedsheets with the feeling of it. However, that kind of intimacy could only sate her for so long, and soon she began to grow somewhat frustrated with it. Come on, I never thought I'd say this to a tentacle creature, but you shouldn't be such a gentleman about it. Go on already, get in deep. As expected, the plant seemed to read her thoughts on the matter, and began to push in deeper, sending further waves of pleasure through her. The vine, already moist, continued onwards within her, with the siren's womanhood stretching out to accommodate the newcomer. Moan after moan escaped Adagio's mouth as it carried on, gyrating her hips to try to get it even further inside. Her motions did not go unnoticed as the vine pushed even harder, eventually reaching her back wall as a result. Okay then, Adagio thought, time to see how vigorous this thing can be to me. As she desired, the vine began to pull out slightly, a feeling that Adagio didn't like in the slightest. After having gone so long without this kind of physical affection, the last thing she wanted was to have her partner pull out. Thankfully, though, the vine only pulled back so it had a good distance to ram back into her. This time it was much more forceful, and Adagio had to bit on her lower lip to stop her from screaming, lest her sisters come in and see what's going on. The vine stayed there, letting her calm down a bit before continuing with its work, moving in and out in a far slower and more gentle fashion. Adagio too was getting to work, raising a hand and cupping one of her breasts, caressing and squeezing it to try to heighten the sensation she was getting now. But down below was where the real action was taking place, and as she was tightening around the vine with every movement it made. By all the sea, it's been so long since I felt this full. Where has this thing been all my life? The siren reveled in the pleasure she was getting from all this, and so failed to notice that more of the vines, which had been lingering on the edge of the bed until now, began to approach her once more. She only opened her eyes when she finally felt them reach her, and saw then that they were coiling en masse around her body. At first she was unsure what this was all about, but it soon became clear what was happening. While the main vine was continuing While the main vine was continuing to move in and out of her, the rest were continuing with their past work, massaging all of her tender areas, most likely in the hopes of making her feel even better as they got intimate with her. A smirk appeared on her face as she realized this. Well, it's been a few centuries since I had a lover this considerate. Please do go on. And go on they did, as every inch of her was being tended to with an expert touch, causing yet further moans of contentment and pleasure to leave her. However, it soon became apparent to her that this combination would lead to her climax very soon, as evidenced by the warm feeling that began to grow in her nethers. The vine seemed to sense this, and so the penetration down below became even more vigorous, and Adagio had to fight even harder to hold back the scream. In and out the wine went, pressing right against her back wall with every thrust. Adagio was panting furiously now, feeling as she was right on the threshold of what she could take. Sure enough, with a final move inside her, the siren lost all control and let out an ear-piercing scream of sheer ecstasy. It was a sensation she had not had in far too long, and every moment of it was a precious gift to her. As the moments passed, she felt herself cool down from this experience, her panting continuing with every second. In time, she felt the wine pull out of her, coated in the juices she'd let forth during their coupling, and all the others began to withdraw also. Eventually, she caught her breath back and turned her head, looking on as many of the vines retreated back to their pot, their work apparently done. A solitary tendril remained, and slowly approached her. Maybe it wants my approval. Well, in that case, I think it's more than earned it. Smiling, Adagio beckoned the vine with a single finger, and the tendril quickly responded, moving right towards her face. Taking her hand, she...
"Gobble my cock!"
She gobbled his cock. Taking her hand, she gently stroked the vine before bringing her face forward, giving it a single kiss on its tip. If there's any confusion, that means you did good. Another happy shiver passed through the vine, causing Adagio to chuckle. However, that moment soon passed as the door to her room burst open, causing Adagio to snap her head in its direction. Sure enough, there was Arya and Sonata, charging into the room with looks of worry upon their faces. Arya spoke first. "Adagio, we heard you screaming." But she was stopped dead in her tracks by the sight that lay before her. Her elder sister splayed out on the bed in the throes of what had to be a few rounds of really hot love-making, with the perpetrator in question still wiggling about in his pot. Going as pale as a ghost, Arya made an about face before walking out the room again. No questions asked. Sonata took a few moments longer than Arya to realize what had happened in this room, and when she did, she looked to the plant with utter shock. Chuckling, Adagio spoke to her little sister. "After much consideration, Sonata, I've decided the little guy can stay." "Well, fuck me,"